The Silver Swan wasn't just a restaurant. It was a theatre of wealth, where every polished wine glass reflected ambition, and every laugh carried the weight of someone trying to prove they belonged. Velvet curtains, crystal chandeliers, and a pianist playing songs no one really listened to. Everything shimmered with a kind of artificial perfection. But to Emma Collins, none of that shimmer mattered. At 22, wearing a black uniform that blended her into the wallpaper, she wasn't part of the performance. She was the invisible hand filling water glasses, balancing trays heavy with truffle risotto, nodding politely at men who didn't remember her face the moment she turned away. To her, the Silver Swan didn't smell like luxury. It smelled like exhaustion. Burnt coffee on her shirt cuff, aching feet stuffed into cheap shoes, and the endless ticking of a clock that seemed determined to stretch her double shift into eternity. And then he walked in. Richard Sterling, the name that could silence a room. Billionaire, industry titan, cover star of financial magazines. He carried himself the way emperors must have walked through conquered cities, like the air belonged to him, like the ground was grateful to hold his weight. Heads turned as he strode to table 7, flanked by 3 men who laughed too quickly at his jokes. Emma had seen his face 1,000 times, but in real life the arrogance was sharper, the aura heavier. She steadied her breath, hiding the irritation behind a trained mask of neutrality. Another rich man, another night. That's all. She thought if she moved carefully enough, maybe she'd get through the shift without drawing his attention. But Sterling had a way of pulling focus, whether you wanted to look at him or not. As she approached to refill his water, she noticed the object he placed on the table. It wasn't one of the gleaming props of the evening. Not a gold card. Not a diamond watch. It was an old leather-bound portfolio, worn at the edges, out of place against the gleam of cutlery. The investors leaned in eagerly as Sterling slid the portfolio open, his voice booming with theatrical pride. "Gentlemen, before we talk about the future, let me show you the seed of an empire." Emma poured water with steady hands, but her eyes, just for a moment, flicked towards the papers inside. Diagrams, equations. And then, her breath hitched. There, scrawled in the bottom right corner of the yellowed schematic, was a signature, the curve of the R, the sharp downstroke of the J. A signature she had traced with her fingertip on old birthday cards, a signature that lived in the memory of bedtime stories about the stars. Her father's signature, Robert Collins. The man who had vanished 10 years ago, declared a suicide no one ever proved. A hole in her life that had never closed. Her vision blurred, the weight of the pitcher suddenly unbearable in her hand. The noise of the restaurant, the clink of forks, the murmur of conversation, the faint notes of the piano, faded into silence. All that existed was that page, that name, and the tidal wave of certainty crashing over her. Richard Sterling's voice cut through her daze, smug and triumphant. The original design for the Sterling core, a vision that changed the world. But Emma knew. That design didn't belong to him. It was her father's. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Every suspicion, every unanswered question of her childhood sharpened into one blinding truth. Richard Sterling had built his empire on a stolen dream. Emma's chest tightened, anger and grief twisting together for her. She wanted to scream, to snatch the paper from his hands, to tell the entire restaurant that the ghost of Robert Collins was alive on that page. But her voice caught in her throat, tangled between fear and fury. Sterling raised his glass to toast his guests, a predator basking in admiration, completely unaware that the waitress standing at his side was the daughter of the man he had erased. Emma's fingers trembled as she set the pitcher down. Her heart pounded with a single, deafening thought. The truth is right here. And she was the only one who recognized it. She drew in a shaky breath, staring at that familiar signature, knowing her world would never be the same. Because once a secret like that breaks the surface, it cannot be buried again. And Emma Collins, once invisible, was about to become the spark that set fire to an empire. Emma Collins wasn't always a waitress lost in the shadows of the Silver Swan. Not so long ago, she was a rising star, a scholarship student with a mind sharp enough to bend the rules of physics. Professors whispered her name with admiration. She had the kind of future people bet on. But futures don't collapse with fireworks. They unravel quietly. For Emma, It was a single phone call. Her mother had fallen ill, a rare sickness that stripped strength from her body day by day. The scholarship covered tuition, not hospital bills, not the price of breathing machines, not the kind of care that devours savings like fire eats through dry wood. And so Emma did what any daughter would do. She traded lecture halls for late shifts, textbooks for trays, and dreams for duty. And behind that sacrifice was an older wound, one that never healed. 10 years earlier, her father vanished. Robert Collins, a physicist whose mind lived among the stars, simply disappeared. They said he left a note. They said he drove to the cliffs. They said he gave up. But Emma never believed it. She remembered his laughter, his promises, the way he filled napkins with equations and called it bedtime reading. That man wasn't built to quit. Yet the world stamped his life closed, and she was left with a hole no one could explain. Every night, Emma carried that silence. She poured wine for men in $1,000 suits, men who argued about mergers while she pretended not to hear. To them, she was invisible, a ghost in black shoes and an apron. They looked past her as if she were a piece of furniture, a body without a story. And maybe that's what cut the deepest, the way her life of sacrifice had shrunk her into a shadow. But here's the truth no one likes to admit. Sometimes the biggest secrets aren't buried underground. They hover in plain sight, daring you to notice. A forged contract signed with shaky hands, a familiar name tucked into a forgotten archive, a page left unguarded in a leather folder. The world is full of invisible clues, and most people walk past them, too distracted or too comfortable to see. Emma wasn't like most people. She carried grief like a second skin, which meant her eyes were always searching, always questioning. That night, when her gaze caught her father's signature, it wasn't a coincidence. It was the universe placing a test in front of her, to look away or to confront the truth that had been dangling above her head all these years. The choice would cost her more than she could ever imagine. But in that moment, as she stood in the glittering cage of the wealthy, Emma Collins began to realize that even the smallest voice could echo through the marble halls of power, and she had no idea that the crack she was about to open would tear through an empire built on lies. For a moment, Emma thought she could swallow it down, pretend she hadn't seen a thing, but the weight of that signature pressed on her chest like a stone. Before she could stop herself, the words slipped out, clear and steady. "That's my father's signature." The table froze. The air seemed to thicken. Richard Sterling's hand, poised mid-toast, faltered. His glass slipped, shattering against the mahogany with a violent crack. Water spilled across the precious schematic as fragments scattered like shards of his composure. Around them, conversation stuttered and died. Forks hovered in midair. Every eye turned towards the girl in the apron who had dared to speak. Sterling's mask cracked just long enough for Emma to see it. The raw panic, the terror of a ghost clawing out of the grave. But in an instant, his arrogance snapped back into place. He bellowed, "Preposterous! This waitress is delusional! Get her out of my sight!" Emma's voice rose above the murmurs, trembling but fierce. "I know that signature. I know those equations. He called it chimera. He told me about it when I was a child. That design is my father's." The word hit him like a blow. Chimera. Color drained from his face, leaving him pale and furious. His investors shifted uneasily, doubt flickering in their eyes. But power protects itself. The manager rushed in, bowing and apologizing to Sterling, while glaring at Emma with pleading eyes. "Miss Collins, you're disturbing our guests. You're finished here." Security moved closer, a silent wall of muscle. Emma's throat burned with injustice. She had spoken the truth, and the truth had been smothered beneath the velvet weight of power. And here lies the cruel cost of truth. It doesn't set you free, not right away. It strips you bare, takes your safety, your stability, and leaves you in the cold. For the rich, a lie can buy silence. For the poor, the truth can take everything. Emma stood frozen, her hands trembling, but her eyes locked on Sterling. He met her stare with a quiet promise of destruction, and as she was led toward the door, the laughter resumed, the glasses clinked, the music swelled, pretending nothing had happened. But something had. A spark had been struck, and though Sterling tried to snuff it out, The smoke of it lingered in every corner of that gilded room. Emma knew one thing as she stepped into the night. Justice had a price, and tonight she had just begun to pay it. Night carried her home like a heavy coat she couldn't shrug off. The streetlights blurred past the bus window, and the echo of breaking glass still rang in her ears. Shame tried to swallow her, but beneath it something harder pressed forward, a steady, growing resolve. She held on to one clear thought: if the truth has a price, then let it buy her a path. She unlocked the small apartment quietly. A lamp glowed in the corner like a held breath. Her mother slept in the next room, machines whispering their tired rhythm. Emma stood in the doorway for a moment, hand on the frame, feeling the old ache rise and settle. Then she turned away. Tonight was not for sleeping. She pulled the attic ladder down, the hinges complaining like old bones. Dust lifted into the air and glittered in the weak light. The heat hit her face first, then the smell. Dry paper, cedar, time itself. She climbed, palms scraping wood, pulse loud in her ears. The past was up here, boxed and labelled in a hand she knew by heart. She moved slowly, choosing each box as if it might bite. Tax papers, winter clothes, kid drawings. There, work notes, written in black marker, patient and exact. R. Collins. She dragged the box toward her, the cardboard rasping against the floorboards, and sat cross-legged like a student bracing for an exam. Notebooks filled the space like bricks, every page packed with symbols and neat margins. She opened one, and the world narrowed to the stroke of his pen. Equations stepped across the paper like careful footprints. Diagrams bloomed, rings, coils, fields, shapes that promised something bright, if only the math would hold. Her father had lived here once, in these lines, building a door in the dark. She flipped deeper. Small notations in the corner, a letter here, a date there, names written in shorthand. One name she had tried not to think about for years. Sterling. She felt her jaw tighten. She kept going. Another box waited in the back, heavier, taped twice along the top. She cut it open with a kitchen knife. Inside, a folder with a harder spine, almost formal. The paper inside had yellowed at the edges. She slid one sheet free and set it on her knee. A partnership dissolution agreement. Legal phrases lined up like soldiers. Terms, clauses, signatures. She read each paragraph slowly, lips moving, letting meaning arrive like a delayed train. According to this, her father had relinquished all claims. According to this, he had walked away with nothing. According to this, he was unstable. Her mouth went dry. She ran a finger over the signature. The R wavered. The J lacked weight. The rhythm of the hand was wrong, as if someone had tried to copy a melody without knowing the beat. She closed her eyes and pulled a notebook beside it, opened to a dedication on the inside cover. For Emma, who reminds me that stars are everyday things. The ink there was confident, the strokes alive. She set the two signatures side by side. One sang, one stumbled. She didn't need a lab to tell her what her bones already knew. Someone had signed her father's name without his hand. Someone had tied a knot in the legal record and called it truth. Her breath shook, then steadied. She kept digging. Beneath the papers lay a manila envelope, tucked down like a secret. She lifted the clasp and shook out a stack of photographs. The first was sun-bleached at the edges. Two young men stood shoulder to shoulder in front of a bland concrete building, both squinting into the light. One of them was her father. Hair longer, smile quick, shirt sleeves rolled. The other had a thinner face, the kind that turns decisive when a room goes quiet. Richard Sterling, years before headlines hardened him. They looked like partners, not rivals, not strangers. Partners. Emma felt the old grief twist into a sharper shape. She held the photo with both hands, thumbs pressing the borders, and the picture warmed as if it might breathe. She imagined the day it was taken, the jokes, the rush of seeing something work for the first time, the promise of what could be. Then she pictured what came after. The private meetings, the sudden walls, the narrative told to investors that did not match the facts inside the lab. Memory is a kind of archive, but it is also an engine. It does not sit still when it is finally opened. It hums. It pushes air through lungs that have grown tight. Emma felt that hum now. Each page brought back her father's voice, gentle and excited, always a step faster than his feet. He had tried to teach her that truth is patient. It doesn't shout, it waits until someone listens. Tonight, she was listening. She spread everything into a grid on the attic floor wall, notebooks in one column, photos in another, legal papers at the center like a wound. She took out her phone, snapping pictures one by one, framing each corner, careful to capture dates, initials, the small pen marks no one else would notice. Her hands steadied with the work. When fear has a task, it grows quiet. Time slipped. Her knees ached. A moth fluttered around the lone bulb, tapping the glass with soft insistence. Still she kept sorting, reading and comparing. She found a note in the margin of a schematic that made her exhale sharply. A thinks the containment field is too unstable. I can solve it. Initials followed. Not RC, the other man's. Another page later, where the math corrected itself, where her father's pen landed on a number that would hold, at least in theory, she thought of a door again. Then, on the way, someone else had used that door without leaving a thank you behind. She picked up the dissolution agreement once more, the fake signature staring up at her like a dare. She imagined the day it was signed on paper. Room too cold, pens too smooth, a witness who didn't look up. She pictured a conversation that moved quickly, glossing over the parts that hurt, and then a stamp that made an untruth official. Paper is powerful when the wrong hands hold the ink. If the truth of a life could fit in a stack of pages, this would be it. But lives are bigger than evidence. They spill out. They touch everything. Emma's mind drifted to the years between then and now. 10 Christmases without his knock at the door. 10 birthdays cut with a blunt knife. 10 New Year's wishes whispered to no one. Time had been stolen from them. Not just money, not just credit. 10 years is a language you forget how to speak until someone returns to remind you. No court can repay it. No apology can stitch it back. The cruelest theft is measured in seasons. This is the part most stories skip. A settlement can repair a bank account. A public apology can polish a plaque. But who pays back a decade? Who refunds the late-night questions, the empty chair at the table, the phone that didn't ring? The world keeps moving while someone's life pauses, and when the pause ends, the world doesn't slow down so they can catch up. Time is the only currency that never returns to the wallet once it's spent. Emma knew this in her bones. She knew it as she glanced at the doorway below where her mother slept, lines of worry carved by years of waiting. She knew it as she pressed her palm against a notebook her father had held. She knew it, and the knowledge lit something inside her that was not anger alone. It was purpose. She gathered the most damning pages into a neat stack. The forged agreement, the earliest sketch of the design, the photo with Sterling, the margin note with initials and doubt. She slid them into a tote, each sheet a breath she refused to let drown. She looked around the attic one more time. Every box left behind felt like a promise she would return. She switched off the bulb, climbing down with slow, careful steps, balancing the weight of what she carried. On the living room floor, she laid the papers out again, this time in a new order. Story before law, faces before signatures, equations before contracts. It made more sense that way. Live first, proof after. Dawn crept along the blinds. The city stirred. A neighbor's radio clicked on, muffled through the wall. Emma sat with her back against the couch, staring at the evidence as if it might speak. It already has. She just needed the world to hear it. She opened her laptop and started searching. Articles, lawsuits, rumors that had flared and gone cold. One name rose like a buoy in the wreckage. A reporter once praised for sharp instincts, now tucked away on the edges of the internet, writing from the outskirts of his own career. He had tried to tell a version of this story years ago, and he had paid for it. Emma copied the address she found and wrote it on the back of an old receipt. Her hand stopped shaking. Her breathing evened out. She slid the papers back into a bag, zipped it shut, and stood. Before she left the room, she paused in the doorway again, watching her mother sleep. 10 years lost, she whispered in her own head. But not one more if I can help it. Then she turned the knob gently and stepped into the hall. Outside, the morning smelled like pavement and coffee and rain that might come. She pulled her jacket tight and started walking, the city waking up around her. The night had given her proof. The day would ask her what she planned to do with it. She didn't know yet how many doors would slam before one opened. She didn't know yet how far the lie had spread its roots. She only knew where she needed to go first. By noon, she would be standing in front of a battered apartment door, knuckles hesitating for just a second before they knocked, ready to tell a stranger that a signature had shattered her life and that she intended to set the pieces in motion. The apartment door creaked open to reveal a man whose eyes had once burned with headlines and deadlines, now dulled by years of exile. Ben Carter leaned against the frame, suspicion etched into every line of his face. Emma's voice trembled but did not break. She told him her name, her father's name, the stolen design, the forged contract, and the photo of two men who were once partners. She laid the evidence on his cluttered table like cards in a high-stakes game. He listened in silence, arms crossed, then shook his head. His laugh was bitter, hollow. He said he'd tried this before, shouted into the storm, and the storm had swallowed him whole. No one cared. No one listened. Emma met his gaze. Her words came out quiet, steady. She said he wasn't wrong. He just hadn't had proof. And now proof was sitting right here, in ink and in her bloodline. Something flickered in his tired eyes, a spark he had buried. He studied the papers again, then her face. The cynicism faltered. The silence stretched until finally he muttered, almost against his will, that maybe, just maybe, this was worth one last fight. Days later, together, they tracked down Walter Schmidt, an old man, hunched by years and regret, who flinched when Emma spoke her father's name. He whispered that he remembered. He remembered Robert being led away, protesting and told it was for his own good. He remembered Sterling's lies, the hush money, the fear that sealed every mouth in the lab. His voice shook as he confessed, but in his confession, the story finally gained a witness. It should have felt like victory. But instead, the walls began to close in. Emma's phone buzzed with legal threats dressed in fine words. Ben's blog crashed under waves of invisible hands clawing at his servers. One evening, Emma came home to find her apartment ransacked, drawers overturned, her father's notebooks tossed, nothing stolen but everything violated. Her mother's frightened eyes begged her to stop, but Emma only clenched her fists tighter. She understood now. Silence wasn't just fear. It was the weapon Sterling had mastered, the invisible chain that kept truth buried. And Emma had just broken the first link. What she didn't know yet was how far Sterling would go to forge the next one. Fan 6, night fell like a lid, heavy and airless, and the road to the facility wound through a black seam of pines that swallowed sound. The place rose from the valley like a promise made by people with too much money, a modern husk of glass and stone, lit just enough to say everything was under control. Somewhere inside, a decade of silence waited behind a door with no name. She parked far from the cameras and walked the last stretch under a sky that threatened rain. Breath tight, palms cold, she counted the seconds. Between the sweep of lights on the perimeter and the pause that followed, timing, not bravery, would carry her across. Timing, and the thought of a man who used to draw the universe on napkins. There was no hero's entrance, only brush that clawed at her sleeves, roots that rose from the ground like warnings, and a dark, grated mouth hidden by weeds, the old ventilation outflow, the forgotten artery. She crouched beside it and listened. Air moved in a slow, indifferent pulse. Machines hummed. Somewhere, a door thunked shut. She loosened the bolts one by one until the metal gave with a small complaint. Cold air hit her face. The duct yawned like a narrow throat. She slid in, elbows guiding, knees pushing, the smell of dust and disinfectant mingling into something she would never forget. The metal pressed close enough to hear her own blood. Each breath echoed. Each scrape of fabric sounded like a confession. In that tight crawl space, the world narrowed to inches. Thought narrowed too. Truth, she realized, was rarely a grand staircase. It was more often a vent, cramped, filthy, unseen, leading to places built to be unreachable. She kept moving, counting the panel seams like beads, pausing whenever the structure groaned. At one turn, She shut her eyes and waited while footsteps scuffed somewhere below. A laugh, muted. A keyring jingled, passed, faded. She exhaled a thread and kept going. At last, a sliver of dim light ahead. She reached the grate and peered through. Pipes ran like ribs along a concrete corridor. Emergency lamps threw a cemetery glow. She worked the screws loose with the edge of a flattened coin, slipped through, and landed on a patch of dust that puffed up like old breath. For a moment she stood still, letting the building's pulse settle around her. The hum became a flaw. The flicker of lights became a map. She moved in short lines, left past a rusted valve, right at a yellow stenciled arrow, straight until the air sharpened with disinfectant. A metal door wore a painted letter, C. The stairwell beyond it swallowed sound. She climbed, each step a measured prayer. At the top, another door, soft close hinges, polished wood on the other side. She cracked it open and looked through. A hallway stretched ahead, expensive and quiet. Pale walls, polished stone floors, lights that hid their sources, as if serenity could be staged. Doors spaced with exacting patience, each with a number in small bronze type and a narrow window of reinforced glass. Not a hospital. Not a home. Something in between, built by people who preferred their problems to be elegant. She stepped out, closed the door behind her. Her heart tried to climb into her throat, and she gently pushed it back down. This was the path Walter had described in a voice that broken men use when they finally tell the truth. First floor, west wing, high security. No names, numbers only. She passed 105, 107, 109, and in each window a slice of life went dim. An old woman staring at a static screen. A man asleep with his fist clenched on the sheet, a middle-aged face twitching with dreams or chemicals, she couldn't tell which. The air felt heavy, as if every forgotten breath from every room had thickened it. She swallowed against the weight. 111. A small scuff at the base of the door said a cart had stopped here often. She moved on. Her fingers found the window without thinking. The glass was so clean that the first thing she saw was her own reflection, pale, drawn, eyes too bright. She leaned in until the reflection broke and the room revealed itself. Bed, chair, table. A figure sitting on the edge of the mattress, back curved like a question mark carved over time. Grey hair, thinner than the memory she carried. Shoulders drawn inward, as if the world had become something with teeth she could not make herself breathe. The second hand of the hallway clock ticked on, patient, indifferent. The figure turned his head a little, profile catching the soft light. The shape of the brow, the line of the nose, the quiet slope of a mouth she had seen smiling in black and white photographs. Father. The word didn't pass her lips. It detonated in her chest. Her knees went weak, and she pressed her palm to the glass to steady herself. The cool of it shot through her hand like a warning. Not yet. Not loud. Not long. She let the tears rise and did not let them fall. Not now. Not when every drop of salt might blur what she had come to see. He was sketching. Not equations. His pencil traced something simple and stubborn. A circle drawn over and over until the paper accepted it. Each pass wore the line deeper. A ritual for a mind the world had tried to fog. She lifted the phone, thumb waking the camera. The lens trembled, then steadied as duty overtook awe. She framed his face, his hands, the room number on the door, the tray slot, the hinge. Evidence first, embrace later. She took 3 photos, then 1 more. She lowered the phone and let herself place her palm flat against the glass, as if the barrier might decide to be merciful. She whispered his name. The sound barely rose above breath, but the silence caught it and carried it forward. His hand paused. The pencil hovered, then fell to the bed. He turned, slow and unsure, as if turning required permission. His eyes were cloudy with years and chemicals, but at their center a spark flickered, tiny and fierce. He looked at her the way a man looks into a room he once loved and isn't sure he's allowed to enter. She swallowed a sob and tried again. Stronger. It's me. The word me had been a child once. It walked on little feet through a kitchen toward a man who smelled like coffee and chalk dust. It had laughed when he turned napkins into star maps. Now the same word stood in a corridor built to erase such things and demanded to be recognized. A crease formed between his brows. His gaze searched her face like a coastline he almost remembered. The spark steadied, grew. He stood, faltered, steadied himself on the bed frame, and took 2 careful steps forward. When he reached the door, he lifted a shaking hand and placed it on the glass exactly where hers rested. Heat did not pass through, flesh did not meet flesh, but the glass caught their hands and held them together in a thin, perfect lie that for a heartbeat felt true. Tears blurred everything. She let one fall and watched it streak the barrier like rain on a window. His mouth moved. No sound reached her, but she read it by the way his lips shaped the word. Her name. The world narrowed to 2 hands and a memory coming back to itself. Then a heavy thud echoed from the far end of the hall. A door, a cart, a voice, footsteps. Choice slammed into her like cold water. Rescue now, raw and impossible, or retreat with proof that could open a door the right way. Her heart lurched towards the first. Every part of her body screamed to break something, to find a key, to pry a hinge. But another part, the part forged in the attic among notebooks and photographs and a forged signature, grabbed her shoulders and pulled her back. If she was caught, the photos would vanish. The truth would be locked again. He would sink into another 10 years of fog. She pressed her forehead to the glass, whispered, "I'm coming back, I promise," and prayed that promises could cross barriers built to break them. His fingers spread as if to catch hers. She mirrored the gesture, palms matched by a pain that refused to be human. Footsteps neared, then hesitated, then resumed. Somewhere a radio crackled. She kissed the tips of her fingers and placed them against his, as if ceremony might soothe what rage could not. His eyes were wet. The spark was no longer alone. She forced herself to step back. Every inch felt like treason. He followed with his gaze, not pleading, not accusing, only trusting her to do the thing she did not want to do. That trust filled her like air after drowning. She nodded once, a promise sealed without witness, and turned away. The corridor lengthened as she retraced her steps, numbers counting backward, breath counting forward. Around the corner, the soft wheel of a cart squeaked, close enough for her pulse to sync with its rhythm. She slipped through the stairwell door, eased it shut, and pressed herself flat until the hum of a passing voice drifted away. In the stairwell's stale quiet, she shook so hard her teeth clicked. She pressed her fist to her mouth until the tremor passed, then took the stairs a step at a time. Back in the basement, the air changed from perfume to machinery. The path felt longer going out, as if the building had grown while she climbed. She found the grate by memory, twisted into the duct, and dragged herself forward with the stubborn patience of someone refusing to fail. Metal scraped. Dust rose. At one bend, her elbow slipped and pain shot through to the bone. She bit down on a cry and kept moving. When the vent opened to the night again, rain had started, fine and relentless. She slid onto the wet leaves, lay there a second, and let the sky wash her face clean. The trees no longer looked like sentries. They looked like accomplices. She pulled herself up and ran, branches tugging, mud grasping, lungs burning, until the dark of the woods thinned and the dull ribbon of road returned. She reached the car and folded into the seat, breath sawing, fingers numb. For a long moment, she could not do anything but hold the phone against her chest, the way some people hold a small animal, as if warmth alone could keep it alive. Then she unlocked it, opened the gallery, and stared. Each image was absurdly ordinary. Poor fluorescent light, grainy edges, a face framed by a cheap pillow, and yet each one was a hammer. She scrolled once, twice, then stopped on the shot where his eyes met the lens. He had looked toward the glass and, somehow, into the future. She let out a sound that was part laugh, part sob. She typed a message with shaking thumbs. The words looked too small for what they carried. She hit send anyway and waited. The reply came back fast, asking if she was safe, asking if she had what they needed. She answered yes to the second, because she had to believe it, and yes to the first, because fear was only useful if it obeyed orders. On the drive back, the wipers beat time against a storm that finally committed. Streetlights smeared across the windshield like spilled paint. Her hand steadied on the wheel because there was nothing left to do with them except steer. A siren wailed somewhere far away. She breathed with the engine, in, out, forward. At a red light, she whispered to the empty passenger seat, and the word sounded less like a vow than like a direction. Home. She needed to lay the images next to the papers, the signatures next to the faces, the dates next to the memories. She needed to build the ladder truth could climb. She pulled into a street and cut the lights, letting the car tick down into stillness. The hallway smelled like someone's late dinner and someone else's detergent. In her apartment, the steady whir of machines greeted her like a lullaby she hated. She moved softly, placed the photos beside the forged contract, and watched the pieces settle into a shape that no longer required faith to understand. It was all there now. The before, the theft, the absence, the proof. But proof does not heal. It points. It demands. Morning pressed its pale face against the window. She sat on the floor with the evidence around her like constellations and thought of the years that had been taken. 10 winters unshared. 10 slices of cake cut without the right joke. 10 sunrises that rose for everyone and not for them together. She let herself grieve for exactly 60 seconds, counted, measured, contained, because grief deserves a chair at the table but not the head of it. Then she wiped her eyes and began again. Names, emails, a plan that would make the whisper of a corridor into a shout the city could not ignore. She knew the risks multiplied now. Noise attracts attention, and attention is the currency of men like the one who had locked a genius in a quiet room. But she also knew what silence had bought. She wasn't paying that price anymore. When she finally closed the laptop, her mouth was set, her hands steady. She slipped the phone into her pocket and touched the spot over her heart where, for an hour, she had held the images like a talisman. She whispered a promise into the dim room, not for anyone to hear, but because the saying of it made it real. I'm coming back to the world. Outside, the rain slowed to a hush. Somewhere far off, the city stretched and yawned and checked its screens. The day waited, blank and bright and hungry. She stood, gathered the papers, and reached for the door. What happened next would turn a photograph into a warrant, a whisper into a siren, and a quiet promise pressed against glass into something the whole world would have to answer. Morning broke with the sound of keys on a worn keyboard and the low hum of a laptop that had seen too many late nights. Ben Carter sat in front of the glow, shoulders squared, eyes clear in a way they hadn't been in years. The draft wasn't a story anymore. It was a map with coordinates and timestamps, a spine made of documents, and a heart made of a daughter who wouldn't let go. He checked the photos again. Room number, face, the line of the jaw, the date embedded in the metadata. He stacked Emma's evidence inside his words like rebar inside concrete. He didn't publish it on his little island of a blog. He sent it to the one editor who had believed him when believing him had a cost. The attachment carried a subject line with no poetry at all. It's real. Within minutes, a reply came back with the only word he needed to hear. Run! The piece went live at 7:12 a.m. A headline cut through the morning like a siren. Where is Robert Collins? The subhead was colder. A decade of silence inside a private facility tied to companies controlled by Richard Sterling. Photographs, affidavits, a signature analysis, the forged dissolution, the margin notes, the names of shell organizations like stones laid across a river, each one a step you could trace. By 7:30, phones began to ring in offices that preferred their Friday quiet. By 7:45, the story slid across home screens in trains and kitchens and classrooms, curiosity turning into disbelief, disbelief hardening into outrage. At 8:05, a panel on morning television began with cautious words like alleged and sources say, and ended with stunned anchors holding a still frame of a man looking toward a camera from behind thick glass. Hashtag after hashtag took flight. The city felt its attention tilt. At 8:19, a lawyer at a federal office who had once interned under a judge who hated bullies forwarded the link to 2 colleagues with a message that read only, "We need a warrant." By 9:02, a request hit a judge's desk, heavy with exhibits. Judges are used to ghosts. They see them peek out from behind bad paperwork all the time. But photographs don't feel like ghosts. They feel like someone is knocking. The order came down before lunch. The perimeter at the facility changed from casual confidence to coiled panic. SUVs rolled up, doors opened, agents moved with that dangerous calm that says every step has been rehearsed, and none of them are here to lose. Administrators tried to smooth the air with credentials and phrases like due process, but the paper in the lead agent's hand carried more authority than their smiles ever would. The locks clicked, the doors opened. Footsteps climbed the quiet stairwell and turned left toward numbers that did not have names. The camera on the body of an officer recorded the moment as a matter of procedure, but there are moments that even bureaucracy can't flatten. The door to 113 swung inward. The man on the bed took a breath that sounded like a page turning. When asked his name, he closed his eyes as if the syllables had been stored on a high shelf, and he needed to reach for them. Then he said it carefully, as if laying each letter back in order. Robert Collins. He added 2 more words that weren't requested by protocol, but were required by love. My daughter. Elsewhere, on an airstrip hung with mist, a jet sat with stairs unfurled and engines tasting the air. Richard Sterling walked with precision toward the promise of distance, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and tight. But distance only works when the ground agrees to let you go. 2 black vehicles eased into place as if they had been painted there hours before. Badges were shown, instructions were given. Sterling's mouth formed the same word men use when they discover that money cannot talk for them in every room. Wait. The cuffs were not cruel, just final. The cameras caught the exact moment when a myth remembered it had bones. Back in a hospital with windows that actually opened, light pooled on white sheets. Emma stood with her hands at her sides like a child rehearsing how not to shake. When the door opened, the world narrowed again. But not to a vent, not to a number on a plaque, not to a pane of glass. It narrowed to a face that was at once older and exactly the same. The lines were new, the eyes slower to focus, but the expression, gentle curiosity followed by dawning certainty, belonged to the man who had once drawn Orion in mustard on a diner napkin. He said her name. This time she heard it. She crossed the room and fell into a place she had been holding open in her chest for 10 years. For a while there were no big words. Time makes you forget how to speak in speeches. She said, "You look like you." He said, "You sound like you." She laughed a broken laugh and pressed her face into his shoulder and, for a few heartbeats, let herself be exactly the age she had been when he left. Doctors coughed politely. Nurses checked charts. The past and the present made room for each other like furniture shifted to fit. Meanwhile, the city performed its new ritual. News vans angled for space near the gate. Commentators held their hands to their earpieces and told the country in precise tones that questions were being asked. A spokesperson for Sterling's company stood in front of a logo and tried to arrange words into a wall. Baseless allegations, ongoing review, privacy of all parties. But walls with fresh paint reveal their seams. Former employees called anonymous tip lines. A nurse from 4 years ago sent a message to a reporter that read, "I knew something was wrong." A custodian remembered a wing that stayed too clean. Silence had held for a decade because many small hands had helped hold it. Now those hands were tired. Inside the hospital, a social worker explained the plan in the voice of someone who has carried many reunions on a clipboard. Detox from unnecessary medication, evaluate cognitive function, short-term care, long-term support. Emma nodded at the right moments, but her mind walked around the words to look at the man in the bed, counting the breaths he took without anyone telling him when to sleep. Ben stood in the doorway like a soldier who wasn't sure he belonged at the ceremony. Emma pulled him into the room with a look. She told her father about the story and the photos and the old man who had finally told the truth. Robert listened, eyes steady on Ben, as if measuring a beam for strength. He thanked him once, simply and completely, and something in Ben's posture eased. Redemption isn't a headline. It's the absence of a certain weight when you lie down at night. By afternoon, The warrant expanded into other rooms and other buildings. Hard drives left with labels. Bank accounts were frozen. A team of accountants who had never thought of themselves as dramatic did the most dramatic thing they knew. They followed the money with clean fingers and sharp pencils. Each shell company gave way to another until the last one revealed a signature that could not be explained away as an oversight. The narrative that had floated finally met the floor. If this were the end, it would be a smooth cut to sunset. But justice is not a curtain that drops. It is a door that opens, and behind it is another door, and beyond that, the mess of living. That evening, Emma walked back into a hospital room where her father had fallen asleep mid-sentence, a book open on his chest that he hadn't been ready to read. She sat in the chair and watched him breathe, counting not to calm herself, but to mark the fact of time returning to them in small, stubborn increments. Her phone vibrated non-stop with messages. Some were from strangers who said they had cried in their kitchens and on their trains. Some were cruel in the way people are cruel when they realize someone else's courage has revealed their own lack of it. Most were just human, messy with spelling and gratitude and anger. She answered none of them. She wrote one text to her mother. He said my name. Meanwhile, the footage of Sterling at the airstrip looped again and again. Men who had once envied him sent carefully worded notes to one another, discussing the volatility of markets and the need to distance themselves from reputational risk. Women who had once endured his dismissive nods watched the clip twice, maybe 3 times, and allowed themselves one small private smile. The stock fell. The lawyers rose. The board met without him for the first time in 15 years and discovered that a void can feel like oxygen. Night settled. In the dim, Emma stood at the window and let the city lights blur. She tried to picture what 10 lost years looked like in a single shape. It refused to become any one thing. It was birthdays and cheap cakes and the way silence makes a kitchen too big. It was textbooks sold for rent. It was telling a hospital billing office that she would call back when the check cleared. It was her mother's laugh thinning out. No verdict could hand any of that back. No settlement could rewind a morning and put a man at a table with his coffee and his notes. Justice had arrived, yes. But it had arrived like rain after a house fire, merciful, necessary, and late. The next day, the district attorney held a press conference under a bank of microphones that jostled for position like birds on a wire. Charges were listed in a voice that had learned how to make the unbearable sound orderly. Unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy, fraud, tampering with medical records, financial crimes that read like a foreign language but translated easily into one word the public understood: theft. Sterling's lawyer tried to assemble a defense built from familiar materials: misunderstanding, miscommunication, zeal. But zeal does not explain a locked door. Inside the hospital, rehabilitation began with humble tasks: walking the hall, drinking water without prompting, answering orientation questions. Robert took each assignment as if it were a problem set handed out after class, smiling slightly when he got one right. Emma kept pace beside him, counting silently, savored and terrified by this new routine. Joy can be frightening when it finally shows up. You don't trust it not to leave if you look away. Reporters asked for interviews. Ben oversaw the storm with the calm of a man who had once drowned in one and learned where to stand. He shielded Emma when he could and stepped forward when he had to. He told the story the same way each time. Evidence first, then people. He made sure to say Walter's name. He said it not to punish an old man, but to tell the truth about how power works. It never moves alone. It always recruits. In a quiet hour, between vitals and paperwork, Emma asked her father a question that had been pressing against her ribs since she saw his hand against the glass. "Do you remember the last day?" He looked at her for a long time, and for a moment she thought she had asked for something he couldn't give. Then he spoke with care. "I remember walking into a room where people I trusted spoke softly and too quickly. I remember saying I wasn't signing. I remember hands on my elbows and words like rest and help. After that, I remember rooms without clocks." She nodded, and her mouth pressed into a firm line to prevent the shape grief wants to take. He reached for her hand and found it without looking. "We will put the clocks back," he said, as if arranging furniture. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, Outside the hospital, flowers appeared on the sidewalk, then signs, then candles. The faces of other missing men and women were taped to poster board, as if one door opening had created pressure behind all the others. People gathered not because they knew Emma or her father, but because a familiar ache had been named out loud. "We lose people to lies," the signs seemed to say, "and we want them back." The facility that had hidden him tried to rebrand its cruelty as care, but the records taken by the warrant told a less generous story. Doctors faced boards, nurses faced questions. Some answered with practiced empty phrases, others, to their own surprise, said everything. When asked why they hadn't spoken sooner, they said the same word over and over: fear. And then they added the truth that stings: money. Emma listened to these interviews later, alone, and the anger she had kept carefully harnessed tugged at its reins. She thought of the module she had carried in her mind without calling it anything fancy, that the worst chains are often woven from consent and silence. She did not excuse it. She did not let it swallow her. She folded it into her understanding of how to move forward. If silence built a prison, noise would be part of the key. By week's end, Sterling was denied bail. The judge looked him in the eyes and said something simple about flight risk, but what everyone heard was a different sentence. "This time, you will stay where we put you." The market adjusted not only to new numbers, but to the absence of a man who had once been the weather. On television, a commentator said that this was a story about accountability. Emma switched the channel off. She preferred smaller words. It was about a door opening. On the first morning, Robert walked outside without a guard. The sun was bright in a way early spring sometimes manages. He squinted up at it, as if confirming a theory, and smiled so small that only Emma noticed. She looped her arm through his. He took one careful step, then another, and the world did not slide away beneath him. A photographer tried to capture the moment. The picture looked like two people going for a walk, which, in the end, is what freedom often looks like from far away. They returned to the apartment that had held 10 years of waiting. Emma paused in the entry, the same way she always paused, listening for the machines in the next room. Her mother sat up as they entered, the slow surprise of joy climbing her face like dawn climbs rooftops. Robert crossed the space between them without hurry and knelt beside the chair, his hands shaking for the first time since the agent said his name with authority. He lowered his head and cried into the lap of the woman who had kept his absence from turning into an ending. She placed her hand on his hair and said the only sentence any of them needed: "You're home." That night, when the house was quiet, Emma sat with a notebook open on the table. Not her father's, hers. She drew a timeline, and then erased it. Time, she decided, could not be forced to behave. She wrote instead 3 words she wanted to remember when the crowds forgot and the trials dragged and the days got ordinary again: truth, patience, repair. She didn't write justice. Justice had arrived already and shown her its limits. It had opened the cell and closed a runway. It had put papers in boxes and names on charges. But it could not reach back into the last decade and extract pain like a thorn. Justice is a tool. Healing is a work. Before bed, she stood at the window and looked at the little constellation of city lights. She thought of all the rooms where secrets still hovered at the edge of vision, waiting for someone to say the quiet part out loud. She didn't feel bigger than the work ahead. She felt exactly the right size for it. Tomorrow there would be depositions and briefings and statements, but tonight there was the sound of her father turning over in the spare bedroom, and her mother's even breathing, and the refrigerator humming a domestic lullaby. Ordinary noises finally allowed to be precious. And if you asked her then what she had learned, she would have said it plainly. The truth will take you to court, but it will also sit beside you at 3 a.m. while you remember how to be a person after survival. It will clear a man's name and still leave a dent where the years used to be. It will give you back what you need to walk forward, not what you lost when you weren't looking. That is the shape of real victory, less like a parade, more like a door that unlocks from the inside. Morning would come again with the same soft insistence, and the city would keep moving. But for once, it moved around a fact that could not be smoothed. A stolen decade had been named, A locked room opened. An empire told no. And Emma Collins, the girl who had been invisible long enough to learn how to see, stood ready to carry both the justice they had won and the wound it could not close. Morning did not arrive with trumpets. It came quietly, like the way understanding arrives after a long night. Slow, deliberate, impossible to ignore. In the weeks that followed, papers were signed with the right hands, patents returned to the names they belonged to, and a new company took shape in a modest building with windows that actually opened. People called it a comeback. Emma did not. She called it work. On the first day, she walked into the corner office that wasn't meant to dazzle. She left the door open. She placed a faded photograph on the desk, 2 young men in front of a concrete building, sleeves rolled, eyes bright. She set a notebook beside it, blank pages waiting like fresh snow. The plaque on the wall read a name that had been missing from too many rooms. Collins. Down the hall, a lab hummed. Stainless benches, careful wiring, whiteboards that did not perform for investors, but welcomed arguments. Her father stood at one of them, marker in hand, posture a little tentative, attention absolute. He wrote slowly at first, then faster, lines of math finding their rhythm, like a muscle remembering its purpose. When he lost a number, he paused, breathed, and traced his way back with a patience that felt like reverence. He glanced over his shoulder and smiled when he saw her watching. It was a small smile, the kind that carries a lifetime. She stepped into the room, rolled her sleeves, and took the marker he offered. Their hands brushed. The contact was ordinary and it was everything. They faced the board together, the old equations he had carried in his head when the world tried to fog it, the new constraints she brought from years spent translating human limits into design choices. He drew magnetic field lines with a surgeon's care. She sketched a modular array that could fail safely instead of catastrophically. Between them, a possibility began to breathe. Meetings were plain and full. Engineers who had left flashy jobs came to talk about torque limits and thermal budgets instead of launch slogans. A lawyer with laugh lines and a backbone explained risk without euphemism. A young intern asked a question that made everyone quiet and then grateful. No coffee was spilled on purpose for dramatic effect. No one performed certainty. They made room for doubt and called it a tool. Meanwhile, Emma learned a new language: cap tables, compliance, payroll. She considered things she had never had the luxury to consider: how to build a benefits plan that didn't punish people for being human, how to set a hiring rubric that saw past the shine of familiar schools, how to craft a policy that protected whistleblowers, not just in press releases, but in practice. She wrote a sentence on the first page of her CEO notebook: "Power is a loan from the people it affects." She underlined it twice. Some days the wound spoke up. It spoke when a calendar reminder pinged for a birthday they had celebrated without him 10 times in a row. It spoke when a sentence of his trailed off, and he blinked, embarrassed, waiting for a word that refused to step forward. It spoke when she walked past a glass wall and caught her reflection, older than she should have been at the moment she finally felt young. The wound did not ask for permission. It simply existed, a scar with a voice. She did not shame it back into silence. She gave it a chair in the meeting and a place on the schedule. Grief, 15 minutes, after stand-up. There were public moments, too. Cameras returned, headlines recalibrated. People wanted the story distilled into something they could carry between a latte and a meeting. She tried to oblige without betraying its shape. On a small stage in a civic auditorium, she spoke into a microphone that squeaked twice, the way cheap microphones do when a room is almost ready to listen. She told them that justice had arrived, wearing the right clothes and carrying the right papers, and she was grateful. But she also told them something less elegant. Justice does not give back birthdays. It does not rewind sunsets. It can restore a nameplate and still leave a dent where a decade used to be. She said it softly, and the room leaned in. Then she said the part most people do not want to hear. This did not happen because one evil man snapped his fingers. It happened because many good people stayed quiet, because silence paid better than conscience, because looking away is the most comfortable seat in the house. She didn't spit the words or wield them like a blade. She placed them gently between herself and the audience, like a mirror held at chest height, "You can hate one man all you want," she said. "But if you want this to stop happening, you have to hate the part of yourself that finds relief in not knowing." The room did not clap right away. Some truths need to settle before hands remember what they're for. Back at the lab, they hit a wall. Equations that promised elegance in theory turned clumsy under the stubbornness of real-world materials. The coils heated where they should have held steady. A containment model that looked angelic on paper behaved like a feral thing in a trial run. Her father's hand began to tremble, frustration gathering in the small muscles of his jaw. He set the marker down and put both palms flat on the table, as if grounding himself against the impulse to rage. He had earned a rage big enough to level a room. He chose to breathe instead. Emma placed a gel pack in his hand and watched the tremor quiet. She spoke the simplest calibration she knew. "We are not owed easily." He nodded, a single dip of the head, and the two of them started again. They changed one parameter, then another. They rerouted a line that had seemed sacred until they dared to move it. They reduced ambition by 10% and increased safety by 20%, and the machine hummed more like a promise and less like a threat. At night, in the too-quiet apartment, her mother slept easier. The machine still whirred, but their song no longer sounded like a clock counting down. It sounded like a neighbor humming through a wall. Emma cooked simple meals that tasted like normal. Her father washed dishes badly on purpose to make her laugh. Sometimes, late, the three of them sat with the lights off and let the street glow wash the room in soft rectangles. No one tried to narrate it. Some victories are allergic to words. When the prototype finally held for its full test window, no one shouted. The room went still in the way rooms do, when people understand they are standing inside a hinge. A line on a monitor flattened into the range it was supposed to live in. A needle decided to behave. Someone remembered to breathe. Her father closed his eyes and smiled with the left side of his mouth, a private habit rediscovered in public. Emma felt the tears come and did not fight them. They weren't the old kind. These were made of relief, not ache. Afterward, reporters asked for a quote fit for print. She gave them one sentence that did not sparkle, and that's why she loved it. "We built this the way we rebuilt our lives, slowly, with help, and without pretending the damage never happened." It ran under a photograph that captured a plain thing, made miraculous by context. A daughter and a father, sleeves rolled, shoulders almost touching, faces turned towards the work instead of the camera. As the company grew, she kept a ritual. Every Monday, first thing, she met with a rotating handful of employees in a small room with bad art and good light. No agenda, no slide deck. She asked 3 questions. What are we missing? What are we pretending not to see? Where will silence punish us a year from now? People laughed the first time. By the 4th month, they came with answers written down. The policy team brought a draft whistleblower protocol that was actually protected. Facilities admitted the lower floor lab had a ventilation issue that made it easier to ignore a faulty sensor. HR pointed out a pattern in promotions that looked like merit until someone bothered to map it. They fixed what fixing could reach. They apologized for what apologies could touch. And when they found a problem too tangled to solve in a day, they wrote its name on a big sticky note and refused to let it blend into the wallpaper. Investors arrived with questions that congealed into one. How fast? She learned to answer the same way each time. Fast enough to be honest. It wasn't the language of tech, darlings. It was the language of people who have seen what happens when velocity is used as a weapon. Some funds walked, others stayed and signed because steady has its own gravity, and because the story of a stolen decade can teach even capital to count differently. On a quiet afternoon, she took her father back to the building where that old photograph had been taken. The sign had changed, the paint too, but the stoop remembered. They stood in the same spot as those 2 young men once had, and for a moment the past and present shared a border without fighting over it. She asked him what he would say to his younger self if he could. He didn't hesitate. I would tell him that triumph without integrity is a long fall with a nice view. Then he added, softer, and I would tell him to come home for dinner on time. She laughed and wiped her eyes and took a new picture. No one would frame it for a lobby. She would keep it on her nightstand, a reminder that the most radical thing they had done wasn't building a machine. It was choosing to live in a way that refused the shortcuts that had hurt them. And when people asked her, as they inevitably did, what lesson she wanted the world to take from everything, she answered with a handful of truths that did not require dramatic music to be profound. Fairness is not a finish line you cross once. It's a habit. Silence is not neutral. It is architecture, and it builds rooms you don't want to live in. Time is the only wealth you cannot insure. Spend it like someone you love is watching. Justice is a door, healing is the room beyond it, and you have to furnish it yourself. On the anniversary of the day the article went live, the team gathered in the lab without champagne. Someone brought bakery cookies. Someone else taped a single paper star to the whiteboard, because the real sky was hidden by haze. Emma said very little. She thanked them for their stubbornness. She thanked the ones who had said no to hurry. She thanked the interns who had asked impolite questions. She thanked the engineers who had the courage to change their minds in public. Then she turned to her father and asked if he wanted to add anything. He cleared his throat and stared at his shoes like a shy student, then raised his eyes and said, "Thank you for returning my name. Now let's earn it." That night, after the last light in the lab clicked off, Emma stood alone at the window and watched the city trade noise for glow. She thought of the first moment, the glass, the signature, the shatter, and the long stretch between that shock and this quiet. She did not romanticize it. She did not diminish it. She let it be what it was, a path she would keep walking with people who had learned how to listen for the softest alarm, conscience whispering before systems scream. If you asked her what comes next, she would not give you a trailer of highlights. She would give you an invitation. Pay attention to what is hovering in plain sight. Tell the truth before it has to be pried out. Give your voice to the place where your silence would be comfortable. And when the door of justice finally swings open, do the unglamorous work of making the room beyond fit for a life. Because in the end, that is the only way the stolen years stop stealing from the years to come. Not by pretending the wound never existed, but by building something sturdy where it used to ache, and by living long enough, and honestly enough, that the ache learns it can rest. If this story reaches you, even for a moment, don't let it end here. Share it, so others can be reminded that the truth may be buried, delayed, or ignored, but it never dies. And think about your own life. Have you ever witnessed a truth hidden in plain sight? A silence that felt heavier than words? Maybe it was small, maybe it was everything. Leave a comment below. Your voice might be the spark someone else has been waiting for. Because every story we tell, every memory we refuse to erase, makes it harder for lies to survive. So carry this forward. With a share, with a word, with a memory spoken out loud.